Hello and welcome to the SRA podcast. I'm Faye.
And I'm Austin.
Quick bit of organizational news before we get into it today. The SRA National Convention is occurring this July 26 to 28 in Denver, Colorado. RSVPs are now open. If you're a member, you should have gotten an email or you should be getting one shortly inviting you to buy a ticket. Tickets are $50 and come with 3 included meals. The first 60 people to sign up will also get discounted rates at the hotel. We have a total capacity of 200 people for this event. So if you're interested in coming out to this event, you should sign up soon. We're going to be establishing a fundraising mechanism for people who maybe might have difficulty affording transportation. We'll have more news on that in the coming weeks. So today I want to apologize if my voice is a little off or if I sound hoarse. I've been at a protest all evening yelling in the streets for police accountability after a number of incidents in our city involving police violence and police misconduct getting completely excused by the court system. So there's a whole lot of that going around lately.
Yeah, I mean, at least it's just localized to like your city, you know? It's certainly not a widespread American problem that the police are a violent force of criminals accountable to no one.
You know, the police are basically a racist gang. You know, they do some good services now and then. Not going to deny and say that police never do anything right, but when they do something wrong, they do it wrong. And the victims of that wrongdoing tend to fall into a very narrow demographic. That is black and brown men.
Yep. It seems to be an extremely dangerous world to be, you know, sleeping in a car or holding a wallet. Or holding a cell phone in your backyard. For any listeners of color out there, just make sure that you don't hold anything or go outside or be in your backyard or anything, and just comply with whatever they scream at you.
Yeah, and obviously we're being sarcastic here because this entire system is a monstrosity in the way that it treats members of our society that are already disadvantaged, usually economically and in other ways. But police violence occurring and the cops getting let off the hook for it is so common at this point and so widespread that it's hard even just keeping up with every occurrence. So back in February, the SRA issued a statement in support of Willie Bo McCoy, a rapper who was shot in his car at a Taco Bell parking lot in California.
25 times. 25
times by 6 cops while he was waking up from being asleep. So reading from our earlier statement, McCoy had apparently become fatigued and was resting in a parking lot, a practice often recommended for the safety of oneself and others. 6 officers approached his vehicle in the middle of the night where lighting was not optimal and confusion could easily occur. We're being generous to the cops here. McCoy was startled awake by the officer's orders and likely made reflexive movements that anyone would make in such a situation. The police claim to have feared for their lives, stating that McCoy did not adequately respond to their commands. Police further claim McCoy reached for his lap, where a firearm was resting. This was provided as justification for the shooting and has been emphasized in media releases. So, just recently, the police department of Vallejo, California has released video of the event, body cam video, and
it was kind of a collection of videos from the various various murderers' body cams and things like that they kind of edited to point out like possibly what the officers were responding to. He leaned forward in his seat and stuff, and they claimed that his left hand was moving towards the gun in his lap. The footage doesn't really seem to show that.
And also, even if it did, that doesn't justify 6 officers all opening fire at the same time.
No, it doesn't. I joke about these things, or I talk about these things kind of sarcastically, because it's really hard. A lot of these things are past the point of humor. They're past the point of being able to joke about them. They're past the point of making snide remarks at the cops. We're past that now. A snide remark is not going to make some of these people feel bad anymore. It's become very apparent that people who question the kind of power that cops wield, that people who make a ruckus, who use their freedom of speech to protest in the streets about the things that happen to unarmed people of color in this country, they turn up dead. They turn up dead in burned out cars. You found something pretty interesting about what someone found in their car.
Yeah, so just to recap what's going on in Ferguson for people who aren't aware, after the Ferguson protests against police violence in Missouri several years ago, since 2014, a number of prominent activists involved in those protests have been dying in mysterious and violent ways. Several have been found shot dead in their cars and lit on fire. So far, Bassem Masri, Darren Seals, DeAndre Joshua, Marshawn McCarroll, Danye Jones, and Edward Crawford Jr. have all turned up dead. Some of these have been ruled homicides, but 3 of them have been ruled suicides, despite the families pointing out that the details of their deaths do not appear to justify a ruling of suicide. There's a real sense that someone is targeting Ferguson activists, and that this person may be a member of the Ferguson Police Department or may have sympathizers in that department. But beyond even the deaths, the pure insanity of what happened, a prominent activist in the area, Reverend Daryl Gray, has received anonymous threats for speaking out on these murders. And recently, he found in his car an unmarked box containing a 6-foot python.
A fucking python. Like they're a James Bond villain.
Somebody planned this, decided they were going to do it. They went out, they bought a python. They found this reverend's car, broke into it, and put the snake in his car as intimidation, as a murder attempt, as a really inept murder attempt. It would be hilarious if it wasn't for the fact that it's tied to the murders of 6 black activists protesting police violence and brutality.
Yeah, like, it is absolutely just beyond humor. Like, it's the kind of laughing you do after a day in which you lose your job, your car explodes, and your dog runs in front of a car. Like, it's so frustrating and so dark. It's truly fucked what happens to people who do speak out and people who do put themselves out there and say that their lives matter just as much as everybody else's.
But to the police, that's not the case. In Los Angeles, a young Latino man named Andres Avila was beaten on the 4th of July at a family cookout in 2011. He was beaten outside at a family cookout, and he filed a complaint against the police. 2 months later, while he was sleeping in the car with his girlfriend, 2 police officers came up on either side of the vehicle, woke him up, demanded that he step out of the car, dragged him out of the car, and then murdered him on the spot. And the police officer who did so was promoted to corporal and was placed on a community relations board after murdering this young man who had dared to file a complaint about unjustified police violence against him. You know, we have this horrible, unjust system in our society, and the people who are the victims of it, the people who want to stand up and fight against this and change the system, are the people who are the most vulnerable to being destroyed by it and being just killed with no consequences. Sometimes it seems like, you know, some random police officer has more power and more authority than the elected officials that run our cities and our states. What kind of system is this that we have basically these people walking around with the power of life and death, which they can mete out at the discretion of their own racist biases and their own prejudicial beliefs?
Yeah, and every time after one of these shootings happens, you can really see the gears kind of turn. Shooting happens, the media goes to the police give their side of it, and then you get news headlines like ex-felon shot dead outside of his home after brandishing a weapon. And then after one of these, you know, fucking white nationalists goes to a mosque and shoots people or something like that, you get these tragic photos of a little baby boy, you know, with his dad or something, who's like, where did we go wrong for this young man? You know, how did such a beautiful star child turn into a mass fucking shooter? It's absurd. You can see the bias that plays out in the media, in the way that like journalists are able to like cover it in like local news, and it's absurd. You can see this racial bias play out constantly.
If this was the National Rifle Association podcast, right now we would be telling you that this is a reason and a justification for you to go out and buy a gun. But that's not really the case. Because the people who are the victims of this sort of systemic violence are people who are going to be victimized even more if they dare to arm themselves. The Second Amendment technically applies to everyone, but in practice, the Second Amendment only really protects privileged white people. For many Black and brown Americans, taking up arms to protect yourself, even when you feel it's necessary, you're taking on the enormous risk that not only will you risk becoming a victim of police violence, but that violence will then later be justified and upheld for the simple fact that you were exercising your Second Amendment right. This isn't an issue that can be solved with guns. This is an issue that has to be solved by making a radical change in our society and making a radical change in the way that people view the police and view Black and brown people and their interactions with the police. This is the sort of thing where if you are a white ally, if you're an anti-racist, which if you're in the SRA, I hope you are.
You better fucking be.
If you're an anti-racist and you're a white person, the best way that you can help is just by going out and being there for the people in your community who are speaking out against police violence. Go to protests. Get between people of color and the cops that want to victimize them. Stand between the victims of police violence telling their stories. Stand between them and the representatives of the state who might want to silence those voices. Go out there and be there and make yourself seen as an ally, as a supporter, as someone who's willing to stand up and put your money where your mouth is and actually, make it known to the powers that be that you aren't going to let this sort of violence continue just because it's happening to members of a marginalized group that the media feels can be safely ignored or villainized. Go out there, be more than an ally, be an accomplice, help your Black and brown comrades to fight against the unjust system of racist policing and police brutality. Because, like I said, this isn't something that can be solved with guns. This has to be solved by going out and making a real systemic change in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. We can spend days on end talking about police brutality in this country and the numerous crimes that the police have committed that they aren't made to answer for. But as a community, we need to come together and find some way to have some kind of oversight of police power. Meet up with community members, draft some kind of petition to create a civilian police oversight board. Find some way to use whatever privileges you have available to you in the system. Those of us who are white, we need to be using the privileges that are inherent to us to be advocating for those marginalized and victimized communities, especially at the hands of police, because the media never covers violence against a white person the same way that it covers violence against a person of color.
And I have to say, things like police oversight are just like a very small first step. So I went to a protest for police oversight because that's what my community is fighting for. But even then, oversight boards can become corrupted. They can be filled with ex-cops and former military who are sympathetic to them. They can have racists on those boards. Something like that is an ongoing project that you have to uphold, and that sort of thing can be corrupted and made ineffective. What we have to fight for is a systemic change, to change the standards to which police are held, to create a societal change, to create an impetus, to change the laws, to remove the absurd level of immunity that law enforcement officers in this country receive that gives them the legal cover to get away with this sort of nonsense. We need to change the standard where a cop can straight up murder someone just because they feared for their life. And apparently cops are the biggest wusses on earth because they get scared at a freaking guy with a cell phone.
Yeah, I understand that this has been said before, but it bears saying that when you call the police, when you're in a situation where you feel like the police should be called, where you're feeling unsafe and stuff like that, those circumstances certainly exist. As far as the ability to, I say this kind of cynically, pacify a situation, the police have pretty much unmatched power to do whatever the fuck they want to pacify a situation. But in saying that, understand that when you call the cops on a person, especially if they're a person of color, you should expect that they will potentially show up and murder that person. So when you're looking at the situation that you're in, please exercise whatever means you have to solve it yourself before calling them, because very consistently we've seen that someone feels unsafe for some reason, often because they have some pretty racist assumptions about the kind of activities that a person gets up to. They call the cops show up, and take it from 0 to 100 in seconds. So just bear that in mind. You know, I trust SRA members more than most people to handle this kind of situation better, but it bears stating.
I would also encourage you to be very careful calling the cops on someone having a mental health crisis, because the police are not trained properly to deal with those situations.
God, no.
They don't understand people with mental health issues, and if someone's having a breakdown, like I said, cops will get scared at anything, and when they're scared, they have a legal justification to execute people. So there are situations, especially, you know, if you're a woman or a queer person or a trans person and there's a burly guy behaving in a dangerous way, possibly threatening you, or in a situation like that, yes, it can be justified to call the police. But if you're not in that situation, if you're not in imminent danger, if you don't have reason to believe that someone else is in imminent danger, consider other options first. The police should never be your first port of call for dealing with an emergency if you have any other option.
Yeah, if you don't have comrades who make you feel safe, try to go get some.
For sure.
Yeah, because when it comes down to it, the tools of the state are not there to save you. The police department is there to protect property. The FBI is there to execute socialists. So, you know.
Yeah. Speaking of the FBI, the Democrats have been calling the cops on the Republican Party for the past couple of years, and that hasn't worked out so great for them either.
Guys, it never works to call the cops on white people. Don't do it.
It's not worth your time. The Mueller report dropped. Well, the report itself hasn't dropped, but the Deputy Attorney General has released his summary.
Yeah, Mueller finally dropped that album he's been talking about.
Yeah, it turns out that mixtape isn't all it was hyped up to be. So it's possible that maybe Barr is lying or obfuscating about the contents, but honestly, because the report can be subpoenaed and can be entered into the congressional record, I don't think that's very likely. Russiagate is a bust. Trump is not going to be arrested by the FBI. He's not going to be impeached. Pelosi is deliberately preventing any serious discussion of impeachment in the House. Even if he was impeached, there's no way that the Senate would convict. Trump will not be removed from power. He will serve out through the end of his term, and it doesn't matter how much people yell about Russia. And I think that's been apparent to most leftists for a while. I have to admit that back in my Bernie Sanders phase, back in 2016 and the immediate aftermath, I fell for the whole Russiagate stuff myself. And there's definitely evidence that Trump and his campaign were pretty fucking slimy, but the hysteria and just the level of certainty with which liberal media has approached this, and just assuming that every, source and every conjecture that they've raised is the truth. They've sort of canonized this theory of Trump being directly tied to Russia and of Russian bots stealing the election. This has just sort of become the accepted dogma of the party, when really the whole thing has kind of always been a bit of a stretch. And it's turned out that the Mueller investigation hasn't turned anything up, whether that's because there is no there, or if Mueller is himself corrupt, or if he's just a Republican FBI agent covering for Republicans, as Republican FBI agents always do. Regardless, the whole affair has come to nothing, and it was a giant waste of time and didn't accomplish anything. And it's almost as if we should have been putting our energies into changing our society in more beneficial ways instead.
Yeah, and that kind of really summarizes the whole thing. They really want you to be focusing on Russia. They really want you to be thinking about... I mean, I'm amazed by the shit that they will bring out. They are going straight up Cold War about some of this, like straight up fear-mongering about Russia and about the things that Russia is capable of, and portraying Russia as just about the most evil country on this planet. Like, I've encountered a lot of people who still pretty firmly believe that Russia is just kind of like a pseudo-Soviet state right now. Like, they definitely believe that Russia is still socialist, and that the Cold War is still on and still happening, and that they're our number one foe.
There's a political cartoonist. I could look up his name, but I'm I'm not going to bother to because it's so stupid. He won a Pulitzer Prize for a political cartoon of a hammer and sickle with the sickle poking up through the ground, the tip of the sickle being the Washington Monument. That was a political cartoon that merited a Pulitzer Prize.
Oh, God, they just jerk each other off. Ugh. I mean, I think that it summarizes the whole thing nicely to say that they want you to be focusing on Russia and thinking about how Russia stole the election because the alternative is that there's something seriously wrong with the system. There's something seriously wrong with the kind of people that Trump has brought out of the woodwork. There's something seriously wrong with our electoral system. There's something wrong with money being involved in politics, that someone could essentially buy their way into the office. And most importantly of all, and I think we all realize this, that there's something seriously, seriously wrong with capitalism. There's something extremely wrong with the way that capitalism influences a country, the way it influences politics and information and media and everything. There is something evil. There's something evil and corrupting and something that is explicitly anti-democracy about capitalism. And they really need people to not be thinking about that.
When you get down to it, our entire society is built along extremely undemocratic lines. There's nothing democratic about working. There's nothing democratic about paying rent. There's nothing democratic about living in a police state where police can just murder you for having the wrong skin color. There's nothing democratic about any of that. And when it gets down to it, our democratic system, our elected officials are just a very, very thin layer of paint on top of a political economic system that is fundamentally based on violence and control of people who do not have power, who do not have wealth, who do not have capital. We don't live in a democracy. We live in an autocracy with just enough democracy to keep us from staging a revolution. And that's really the brilliance of the American system when you get down to it.
Right. And so when we suggest things like go out into your community and petition to create civilian oversight and things like that, there is no blueprint existing for that kind of thing in the American system. If we want democracy, we are going to have to go outside of the system and force it to concede to us. That is just what we're going to have to do. The only democracy that we're going to enjoy in this country is what we create ourselves. So get together with your community members and go create it.
Go out there and get that bread.
For sure.
But, while we're on the subject of talking about things that are seriously wrong, let's talk about what's wrong with Joe Biden.
Would anyone ever let Joe Biden babysit for them?
Oh, God, no.
Yeah, I don't think that letting Joe Biden... he acts the way that he does in front of cameras. He's like an exhibitionist creep. Like, he needs you to know that he can't be trusted.
Like, there is no way in hell that at some point some staffer, some aide, someone must have gone up to Joe Biden and said, "Hey, can you maybe stop putting your hands on random women and sniffing their hair? It's kind of creepy."
Hey, have you noticed that there's like a really big age difference and power difference between you and who you're sniffing? Please stop sniffing underage girls on camera, Joe. Please stop.
But this is sort of the thing where Democrats are all too happy to point out Republicans engaging in this sort of behavior. And that's great because Republicans are fucking awful and usually they're worse. That fucking creep from Alabama. What's his name?
His name was Peter Childripist.
Roy Moore.
That was close. Yeah, I mean, someone can explicitly just be banned from public spaces and still run on a Republican ticket, and they're like, I don't know, it's kind of more important to me that trans people can't use the bathroom than it is that he might abduct random underage girls, I got my priorities, that's where they're at.
I just have to say real quick, the very first article that comes up when I looked up Roy Moore pedophile is an op-ed in the Washington Post saying Roy Moore is not a pedophile. And the gist of the article is that technically he's not a pedophile. Technically, he just serially harassed teenage girls. And I think this ties into the Joe Biden thing really well, because it shows how far out on a limb so many people in our media and so many people in our establishment are willing to go to give powerful white men in politics another chance, to give them an excuse, to give them some justification for why, oh, well, it's not as bad as it seems. You know, people are willing to believe the absolute worst possible about a black man killed by the police. Because the police are an institution that white people trust. And so we're willing to put a lot more belief in their stories. But when black men, when women, when trans people or queer people are victimized by people in power, suddenly their stories are suspect. Suddenly we don't trust them, and we think they must have an agenda, or, you know, we must think that the people in power are being treated unfairly.
Fucking preach.
When it gets down to it, we're willing to make any excuses possible for a powerful white man. And it really disgusts me that Democrats are so willing to point out bad behavior on the Republican side, which the Republicans absolutely deserve. They're garbage. The Republicans are absolutely worse. But at the same time, Democrats aren't willing to hold people in their own party accountable to the same level. Joe Biden should have been run out of the party a fucking decade ago. He never should have been vice president, because this sort of thing was documented before he became vice president. And since then, it's the number of incidents caught on video or reported by women who he made uncomfortable. The amount of evidence involved is just stacks up higher and higher every year. And yeah, he's not as bad as Roy Moore, the fucking actual pedophile, but he's still behaving inappropriately around young girls, sniffing their hair, kissing the backs of their head, putting his hands on their shoulders or their waists, getting creepily familiar with women that he has no relation to.
Yeah, like it it really is kind of tough. It's like it feels like only a Democrat or a Republican is viable, but one is okay with an implied rapist and one is okay with just an explicit one. So, I'm not sure.
But you know what has made the sea change in holding these sorts of men accountable? It wasn't voting. It wasn't a piece of legislation. It wasn't some sort of legalistic process that where suddenly white men are more likely to be held accountable for their crimes. You know what changed it? People who have suffered violence at the hands of these people coming forward and telling their stories and changing the narrative and getting support from allies who do have privilege, who haven't experienced those things themselves. The Me Too movement, which is not a perfect movement. It has had its problems over the years. But the Me Too movement was a societal change that resulted in real change to the way the systems of our society work. Me Too has brought powerful men to account for the sexual crimes against women that they commit. We need to have that same thing. We need to have a Me Too for Black people and Latino people and all people of color who are abused, who are murdered by the cops, and whose stories are discounted in favor of police narratives that are often falsified to justify the violence against them. We need to have a real societal change to make this happen, to stop this sort of violence from occurring. And in order to make that change happen, you have to get out of your chair. You have to go out. You have to join protests. You have to listen to marginalized voices and amplify those voices and protect those people and get between them and use your privilege to shield them from the violence that the police would otherwise willingly inflict upon them. You need to go out and be an activist. You know, being a socialist isn't just about reading Marx or reading Kropotkin and just having correct opinions about theory or about historical events that happened 80 goddamn years ago. Being a socialist means going out and fighting for the marginalized and the oppressed in your community, and fighting to bring power and justice to the people who have no power and have no justice.
Abso-fucking-lutely.
And speaking of using your power and socialism, you also need to remember that you have power at your work. You have power to withhold the labor that your boss extracts from you, and you can use that to get concessions from the owning class that controls a third of most people's entire lives. I'm talking, of course, about unions. After the break, we'll be having an interview with a number of union organizers in the SRA, members of the United Electric Union, a radical union which doesn't just organize electric workers, but people in all kinds of fields. They'll be giving us some practical advice on how you can form a union, what sort of actions they've engaged in, how you can start that sort of organizing process, which I think is invaluable information for any socialist, especially because unions in this country are so disempowered that many people don't even have access to that institutional knowledge that people used to rely on in order to learn how to build a union. So I highly recommend listening in and listening to that interview after the break. In the meantime, Austin and I, and another comrade who wished to remain anonymous, recorded a cover of Solidarity Forever. So stick around for that, because I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, enjoy my banjo playing.
When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. Is there aught we hold in common with the greedy parasite who would lash us into serfdom and would crush us with his might? Is there anything left to us but to organize and fight? For the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. All the world that's owned by idle drones is ours and ours alone. We have laid the wide foundations, built it skyward stone by stone. It is ours not to slave in, but to master and to own, while the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of armies magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
All right, folks, welcome back. Today we have an interview with two organizers with the United Electrical Union, Gary and Lindsay. They're going to be talking to us today about some of their experience with organizing strikes and labor actions and helping working folks get organized. Say hello.
Hello.
Hey.
So can you tell me a little bit about United Electrical and your role in it?
Sure. This is Gary. So United Electrical Radio and Machine Workers of America started in the 1930s in Buffalo, New York, and it's made up of a bunch of workers who organized their shops. Some of them had already formed independent unions. Others had not yet formed unions. And they met and formed a sort of conference in Buffalo in the late 30s and formed the union we have now. It's got a pretty radical history. Don't know if we got time to go into that. It's one of the unions that got kind of ripped apart by the Red Scare, refused to sign the affidavits declaring that, there were no communist membership or leadership. And once that happened, the federal government forced union elections in all their shops, and the UE got raided by all sorts of other unions, particularly more conservative unions like IUE, the UAW, IAM, and IBEW. So it's miraculous that the UE survived that, for one, but it's kind of remained this feisty, radical union ever since, and they're still not affiliated with AFL-CIO.
Right on. So you're both organizers with the union. Can you tell me a little bit about your work? As I understand, Lindsay, you organized a shop floor union up in Vermont that affiliated with UE.
Yeah, so I was actually a rank and file union member up in a shop in Vermont, in Burlington. It was a food co-op, and I worked there for about 5 years. I wasn't there when we had formed the union, but I was involved on the level of being a steward, as well as the vice president of our local, sometimes in the roles of chief steward and president, depending on what was going on, because we had people who were in and out in terms of our leadership at the time. There's a lot of transition. And one of the biggest high-profile cases, we had to have a grievance because in our kitchen, we had a lot of refugees who worked with us, and for the longest time there was no issue. They were able to speak their native language, and one day the boss didn't like that, so he instituted a rule saying that all workers had to speak English because, didn't want anybody being able to talk about it behind his back without him understanding. So we distributed buttons among the entire rank and file that said, what's the difference between English only and whites only? And management ended up, at the end of the day, backing off because what they did was a unilateral change in working conditions. And they can't change a thing like that without bargaining with the union. And we made it very clear that we would not accept a rule like that. And it got a lot of attention in the community, and management eventually had to step back and concede on that.
That's awesome, and it's especially great to hear that the whole shop came together and stood up for the rights of workers who were refugees. In a situation like that where maybe there isn't a union, it's quite likely that nothing could have been done. So that's really awesome that you're able to generate that sort of action and get that sort of result. That's really heartening to hear.
It was very disheartening to think that a food co-op, which is, supposed to be one of these progressive workplaces, taking on such a patronizing role in being a boss.
Right, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand is that, just because something is organized as a co-op or organized as a supposedly progressive workplace, that doesn't always mean that that bears out in reality. At the end of the day, workers always have to be organized in order to secure their rights, and you're able to do just that. So, Gary, would you mind speaking a bit about some of your work? As I understand, you were involved in an action here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I was. It's a nonprofit out there that we organized last year. I was not part of the organizing campaign. Lindsay worked on that along with several other staff members. It's a nonprofit that's contracted out by the state of California to do kind of casework for developmentally disabled folks in California. So a lot of them are kind of social workers. I think they generally describe themselves that way. So they organized with us last year. The boss has been very reluctant to make movement as far as contract negotiations go. We've made some gains here and there, but feels like we're at a stalemate on several key things, and it's pretty clear that the boss isn't backing down. So I've been helping out with negotiating the contract whenever I'm out there trying to talk to the leaders and talk to them about how to keep the organizing going throughout this whole contract campaign, preparing them for any meetings that are coming up. And the latest thing that they needed to prepare for was whether or not to strike. We wanted to get a contract before summer, basically, and the boss is being really slow about it. So what we needed to do was have a serious conversation about how willing we were to put up a fight on this. So we had a meeting and we spent like a month preparing for it. We sent out notices, and then more notices a couple weeks later, made sure the bargaining committee, texted everybody and walked around the shop the day before and the day of. And we had a meeting at lunchtime, and out of like 180 or so people who worked there, 110 showed up to this meeting, and about 105 of them voted to authorize the bargaining committee to take whatever actions necessary to get a fair contract, up to and including work stoppage. So they voted to do that. The next day, we just had a long talk about what we needed to do to prepare for such a thing, and they decided to do a one-day strike, what has amounted to, I guess, a warning strike to the boss. And the good thing about that is it went really well. Out of all the people who were scheduled to work that day, I think like 85% of the shop walked out. And now they know that they can do that and go back to work, and the boss can't do anything. That's a really empowering moment for them. So we've still got contract bargaining sessions coming up, and they know that if they want to, they can walk out and get what they want. They're not afraid, So that's where that campaign stands right now. We'll see how it goes over the next 2 months.
That's great to hear, and that is really, sort of the core of it is once workers realize they have that power and realize how much they're able to do in the face of their boss's objections. From my talking with people both at my workplace and elsewhere about unions, a lot of people really feel helpless and like they don't have any power, like anything that they do will inevitably result in them being fired. Being able to organize and overcome that and just let people know how much power they do have if they stand together is, I think, one of the most critical parts of, union organizing.
This whole, the organizing campaign and the contract negotiations and this action that they just pulled off, it really would not have happened at all if it weren't for the members on the ground actually doing the work. There's a fantastic group of people who work at this nonprofit who are willing to put in the time and do the work to make this happen. Once they have a contract, they're going to be able to run the shop. They're going to need minimal assistance from an actual union staff person, and that's the way a union local should be run. It needs to be the workers showing the boss that they're not going to put up with it anymore, and they don't need to rely on some outsider coming in to fix their problems. They can do it themselves. They have so many connections with community members and different community organizations that came out to support them, particularly Union del Barrio. They came to that meeting I was talking about earlier and spoke and participated in the strike. It's just they've organized themselves really well, and they've got a wonderful community support network in place already.
Awesome. And just to clarify, this is the Lanterman?
Yes, sorry. The Lanterman Regional Center, UE Local 1018.
Awesome. So, Lindsay, can you tell me about the roles that you played in organizing and helping this union get off the ground?
Out in LA?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So I wasn't there for a lot of the groundwork that was laid. I got a call, and they were like, yo, we need you to go to LA and bring this election home. And I said, I can do that. So we headed out to LA, and, I met up with the group of leaders out there. They really ran the election, and the boss made a lot of mistakes. And one of the mistakes that they made was before we had even got involved with the workers, they had already had some semblance of organizing or organization. And the main person who got in contact with UE had started to put together his own newsletter, talking about how they needed to unionize, and was already distributing that among the workers, as well as one whole department in the shop actually had, at one point, the vice president of the regional center was going around on a listening tour, trying to make it seem like they're really invested in the workers, and the workers can it's kind of just like buying them pizza but with more of a face. But one department had put together a list of grievances, and it was not a short one. It was a couple of pages long, about 6, I think. And when the vice president got to their department, they forced him to sit down and listen to them read out loud 6 pages worth of what needed to change. and he was like, And so they gave him a copy, and then they gave a copy to the secretary for the president of the regional center to give to her. But as it turns out, she keeps saying that she never got this list of grievances. And in her mind, if only she had gotten this list of grievances, you guys wouldn't be in this position of having to organize a union, and we could just have, this old buddy system we used to have where everything would get worked out and there would never be any issues. So she kept saying over and over again that she never got this list. And a week before the election came down, she had said once more that she never got the list, and one of our leaders went out of her way and emailed this list yet again directly to the director. The following week, they're allowed to do a captive audience meeting not the day before the election, but the day before that, because 24 hours before an election, there's not supposed to be an introduction of any new literature or any other captive audience meetings. And in this captive audience meeting, she said that she never got the letter. And so
is that an IT problem, or maybe there's some other, maybe the problem is somewhere else?
Yeah, right. So the leaders printed out the email where she said she was in receipt of the whole list there, and they just posted it on every board in the office, and everybody would go to the boards and be like, "What? She's lying to us?" And so that just really sealed the deal for the election.
Yeah, that's honestly rad as hell. And when it gets down to it in that sort of situation, management is their own worst enemy. Once the workforce knows that, hey, our boss is a disingenuous liar, at that point there's really no reason to play softball anymore.
Yeah, it really was. So part of talking to people, you agitate them on their issues, and that was a really nice couple of hours of talking to people being like, yeah, she's lying to you about that. What else is she lying to you about? And people were just getting really interested in making sure that they win the election. They won, I can't remember the margin exactly. I think it was almost 70% voted yes for the union, which is, in that case, that's a mandate from the membership.
Absolutely. Are there any other experiences with organizing that you think are really impactful, or that you think are particularly interesting or illustrative?
Well, me and Gary, we busted up a mob union.
Oh, now you have to tell me about that.
Sure. This is the election we won. I believe the announcement that we won this election was last September. But this campaign had been going on really since the preceding April. That's when we started making phone calls. So this was about the railroad industry. We were organizing folks who work for a company subcontracted out by the railroad companies to transport railway workers. So railway workers have to be transported to different sites within rail yards, because rail yards can be very large. So they got to be taken from one end to the other all day long. They have to be taken from one rail yard to another rail yard. They got to be transported to and from their hotels, because some of these guys are traveling, all over a wide region where they work. And up into the mid 90s, the job of transporting these workers was within the railroad company itself. They were employed, they had the same employer, they had the same benefits, they had the same union representation, all that. So in the 90s, the railroad companies decided that this position, they didn't want to pay for it anymore. So they just started laying people off. They started using taxi cab companies, and then a couple of other companies popped up to fill this void, this service that needed to be provided. So now what you're left with is a bunch of people doing jobs that they used to get good pay, good benefits for performing, and they had a good union that made sure that their jobs were safe. And now you have people working for, in some cases, $8.50 an hour. They get treated like they're they're underlings, like they're less than the railway workers. So I think around a decade ago, when the UE organized a group of folks who worked for one of these companies called Rensenberger in Chicago, and shortly thereafter, there were other areas where folks worked for Rensenberger, transporting railway workers, and they heard about our union and the victory in Chicago, and they wanted in on that action. They wanted us to come help organize them. And while we're doing that, another union pops up, and I don't know if they contacted the company or vice versa, but this other, corrupt, mobby company union, Local 707 is what they were called. They just start making deals with the railroad companies and yards all over the country. And the main purpose of that was the company did not like us, so they didn't want us in there. And if they made an agreement with this other union, it would make it a lot more difficult for us to come in and organize, because then we're not fighting the company, we're fighting the company and another union. So fast forward to last year, the beginning of last year, or I guess April or so of last year. By that time, we had organized these drivers in several different states. We had about 1,000 nationwide with a national contract and regional, memorandums for different states, because different states have different needs. And we finally start a real campaign to basically kick out this mob union. We started calling people, drivers throughout the country who had responded to a Facebook ad we put out. And the biggest responses we got were in Colorado and New Mexico. And the main reason for that is because those drivers, who now work for a company called Halcon, because Halcon merged with Rensenberger. So the big name now is Halcon. So the drivers in Colorado and New Mexico had a lot of communication with the drivers in California, whom we had organized. So they frequently would get to talk to people in California who would tell them, oh, you got that local 707? No, you got to get rid of them. You got to get the UE. So that's where it really started, Colorado and New Mexico, and then making phone calls to folks out in Indiana and Illinois and a little bit of Missouri and New Orleans and other parts of Louisiana and a little bit of Texas. I feel like I'm probably missing something in there, but you get the idea. They spanned across 8 different states. Yeah, a little bit of Minnesota. And, it was like several months of just making phone calls. And then we finally get to the point where we go out and get people to sign petitions. And about a month or probably 2 months of that, we submit those petitions and it's on. We got to get ready for an election. And then Lindsay gets sent out to New Mexico twice. And one time it was like a month or something?
Yeah. Oh, God. And it was in the middle of summer, so everything's like, 100+ degrees. We're like chasing people down on black tar, like concrete, and it's just like so hot. And it's the middle of monsoon season.
So, yeah, we basically have to hang out on rail yards at all hours. We gotta one day maybe be out there 4 hours in the morning or go take a nap, come out for a couple hours in the afternoon, take another nap maybe, and then come out and stay for 4 hours or so at night or more than that. Sometimes you just stay at a yard all day, depending on how big and how busy it is, because that's the only way to get in touch with these drivers. And you just hope you don't get kicked off the property, because we can be there until we're told we can't be there. So that's always a risk. They can remove us on the property. They can call the police on us, but we didn't have to deal with that too much. There were a handful of us spread throughout these 8 different states, just constantly running down drivers, making sure people knew what was going on, making sure they had the information they needed to make a good decision, and making sure they were receiving their ballots, because this was a mail-in election. So we were on the ground making sure people were getting their ballots, they knew how to fill them out, and that they were mailing them in. The one thing you can't do in that situation, there's several things you can't do, but a big one is mail it in for them. So we got that request all the time from prospective union members in a mail-in election. They'll want you to start doing the work for them a little bit, but that is very illegal. So if anybody listening is involved in a mail-in election, The union organizer cannot mail it in. The only person who can mail in a ballot is the person who is doing the voting.
Right on. And so at the end of the day, you won that election, right?
We won 75 or so percent of the vote. Then neither one of us were involved in the contract bargaining portion, but they ended up in bargaining for the national contract. It was up for renewal. We ended up getting card check, which is like the holy grail of organized, because that whole process that we just described, that took, like 6 months or so of organizing to have an election and then to win an election. If you have card check with a company, you don't have to do that anymore. So now the company basically decided.
Real quick, can you explain for the listeners what card check is?
Yes. Card check is where you don't have to have an election. In this particular industry, if you go onto a rail yard or one of their regions, they're divided up into their little transportation regions. If you go to a region now and we sign up just on cards or a petition, 50% of the drivers, they are automatically members, and they automatically, from that point forward, get all the benefits from the national contract. We don't have to go through an election. We don't have to deal with the boss's lies. We don't have to deal with another mob union trying to come in and screw around with an election. Basically, we don't have to do that anymore. The way union elections are set up is for unions to fail. This is not to benefit the workers. This is so the boss has every chance they can to convince their workforce that they don't need a union. That is the entire purpose of the construction for the union election that we have in place in this country. If you got an employer who agrees to card check, you don't have to do that anymore. So the company basically agreed to this because they didn't want to put up with this fight again. They had enough, and it was obvious to them that they can't win this sort of thing against us.
Awesome. So that's sort of something that comes up a lot when talking to people about unions. In my experience, is everyone's worried about corruption, and they're worried about, this union isn't really going to represent me. But at the end of the day, the only unions that ultimately matter are the unions where the workers are engaged, where the workers are the union, and union administration is just there to support them. And when you have a corrupt union, or when you have a company union that's only there to discourage actual organizing, it is possible to fight back and to win, like you guys did.
That's totally the case. We're a member-run union. That's how we talk to people about our union. That's how we talk to current members and prospective members, people we're trying to organize. That's something that's drastically different with us. I tell, whenever I'm going out to talk to members, like I did earlier today with my old local, actually, UE 170, so West Virginia Public Workers Union. I was a member of that union when I was a state employee. I don't work for the union, but I make sure to tell the union members that I work for them. They too often start thinking about the hierarchy of things, because that's what you have in the workplace. You have your middle management, your supervisor, whatever, and then the manager and the director, the president, CEO, whatever. You have this hierarchy. So it's often, a union member will start to view the union that way. They'll start to view their stewards as being above them. They'll start to view the union staff as being above them, and the officers and all that, when it's totally the other way around. I work for the members, like they're in charge. Ultimately, it's a group of members that's elected by their coworkers to represent them, who tells me what to do. That's how this organization runs. I mean, that's why we don't fall into a lot of traps that other unions fall into. We don't, funnel money into the Democratic Party or, any election really. Some of our locals vote to put their own money from their own treasury into like local political campaigns, but it's rare, if ever, that the UE National puts any money into any political campaign, and that's because members don't want that shit.
Yeah, return on investment with political donations for unions, especially these days, not really there.
Oh yeah, it's bullshit. I was talking about card check earlier. Unions put a ton of money into Obama. Like the big reason was because they really thought they were going to get card check, national card check. Like no more bullshit union elections required to organize workers, and it didn't work out. But it did. I mean, nobody learned a lesson from this. We had a chance to have card check, and it didn't happen.
Right. The best that ended up happening was near the end of his term, we got an accelerated process for the election, which as soon as Trump gets into office, he undoes that, and we're back to having to wait 6 or 8 weeks after filing for an election to actually have it, and that's like an entire open season for management to go out and try and bust the union. I mean, we've been in existence since 1936, and we've known that neither party actually represents the interests of the workers, and the only thing that the workers can do is fight for themselves collectively against the boss and make the best gains that they possibly can on the shop floor. Only by doing so can we continue to organize the unorganized, which is UE's mission. And in doing so, we raise the floor for all workers across the country. That's why we need to have more organized labor, is to raise the standards for all workers, because there ain't going to be anybody else who can do it for us. And the workers really need to be the people who do that and in charge. UE is against the idea of a business union, a top-down, top-heavy bureaucratic style that many unions adopt. A lot of the union officers end up living like the boss because they get paid bloated salaries, which come directly from the members, and they see little return because they're not getting the skills that they need in order to run their own locals. They're actively discouraged from doing so because then they might have too much power and can take on and threaten this idea of a business union structure by taking on a more rank and file structure. I mean, we saw that almost happen with the Teamsters, right? A couple of years ago, they went through a very contentious internal election where the institutional people who were in charge were being challenged by people who call themselves the Teamsters for Democratic Union, fighting to get their own people who believe in a more rank and file nature to their union, where members can run their own union in leadership roles to effectively change the way their union operates. So oftentimes we get red baited among other unions on the left or in the union movement. And a lot of the rhetoric that gets thrown around is that our union, the UE, is small and we can't stand up and fight, or we can't empower our members, or they just like to talk us down because at the end of the day, the rank and file unionism is a threat to their business. We know that their rhetoric isn't true. We've been around. We made it through the Red Scare. It's because rank and file unionism works. It worked, up in Erie, Local 506 and 618. They took on corporate greed from one of the largest industries, Fortune 500 company, Wabtec, and they took them to a strike. And they won in 9 days, freezing ass temperatures. They stood outside around burn barrels and made sure that the company knew that we weren't going to play ball with them until they sat down at the table and treated us like equals.
Hell yeah.
So I got a little passionate there.
No, that's good. That's, you can't rely on having a union bureaucracy. You can't, obviously you need paid organizers, people who have experience in multiple shops, who can travel, who can go places, who can represent the union and help workers organize. But once you start getting into a situation like the Teamsters, where you have this union hierarchy, where you have, a union that operates in its own interests, in the interests of its own organization, rather than in the interests of the workers, that's when you get situations where the Teamsters negotiating a two-tier system with UPS, which is totally contrary to the interests of the workers. So absolutely a shop floor rank and file union, like the sort of thing that UE does or that IWW does, which I'm sure it gets even more flack than you guys. An organization like that really is a lot better in the long run at securing gains for workers than just having some arcane bureaucracy of questionably elected people.
I heard the comment about the two-tier system and just thought, nobody should be under any illusions that the UE is absolutely perfect and we can win any battle against any boss. We've got two-tier systems in some of our shops. We've got great contract language in some shops. We've got, not as great language in other shops. And a lot of that has to do with the membership. When union members fully understand that they are in charge, that they have the power, that we're there to support them, that's when it works out for the best. When they understand that they're going to run the show, that they're going to run the campaign that they're going to organize within their own shops constantly, because that's what it takes. That's when we're able to make gains. So we have this relationship with a union up in Canada called Unifor, which is a pretty radical union. And they came down to talk to, our union leadership and the local 506 leadership in Erie after the strike, because they just wanted to understand what just happened and how they were able to do this. And they're completely amazed that it wasn't because, the union had constructed this online communication system or had mass texting to let everybody know what the updates were for everything. This was entirely member run. Those guys had 1,700 people not show up for work by word of mouth. And that is not a joke. They did this themselves. And when workers can do that, they're unstoppable.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of people in the SRA and on the left in general who work in crappy workplaces under bad bosses. There are a lot of people who are interested in forming a union, but they don't know where to turn to. They don't know the steps of how to actually begin organizing their coworkers. So what would be the first steps if someone who, maybe doesn't have a whole lot of organizing experience, but they're passionate and they want to try and, get better conditions for themselves and for their fellow workers? Where can they start in getting a movement to form a union started, and who can they turn to for support?
Well, the first thing that should happen in a workplace is, if you wanted to start a union, you would find a couple of people that you think would be on board with doing that. Oftentimes that might take being in a job longer than a couple of months. Once you have been able to build relationships in the workplace, think about who would be on your side and who has reasons or grievances and things you can be able to open up a conversation and sit down with people. Once you have a small group of people, you can start to put together an organizing plan. And there are 5 steps that you would normally take to get a union. So this small group of people would need to identify leaders in the workplace, in all the major departments, all the shifts, and reflect the workers in the workplace based on nationality, racial, and gender. You want the people who are going to be in this committee that you're trying to build to reflect who the members are and the workers in the workplace. And once you are starting to build that by talking to people, determining their issues, agitating them on their issues, asking them to be involved in the former union, then you're also at the same time gathering information on your workplace, right? Do you know all of the shifts? Do you know all the departments? Do you know where everybody is? Do you know all the workers who work there? Oftentimes, what you'll end up having to do is either workshop with all the people you've already gotten involved in writing down the names and all the numbers they know of the people in the workplace and make a list. Or sometimes it can be just as easy as, you have to clean the boss's office and somehow a photocopy of the employee list made it out in your backpack, for example. How fortunate. Or a lot of companies have online portals that you can that map out the whole workplace for you, and you just hit print. Using all the available means to put together a comprehensive understanding of what your workplace looks like, where people are grouped together, and through that you have a list of your coworkers, and that's what you're going to use in order to contact everybody in the workplace, get an idea of where, and figure out where you need to focus your energies. And that process is pretty lengthy, right? But once you have your list and once you have your committee built, and what we would say is a good committee is about 10%, so 1 for every 10 workers, those people are going to sit down and they're going to do step 2, which is adopt an issues program. Sometimes it would look best putting it down like your top 5 grievances that you're going to organize, things that you want to change in your workplace that benefits everybody, And you want to make sure you get everybody's input for that, because you want it to be representative. Again, about the workers. It's about the workers' conditions and under which they want to work for this company. At this point, a good idea would be to put it down on a card so that when this committee goes back into the workplace, that when they have conversations with their coworkers, they can show them, this is what we're organizing for. These are the things we want to change. And it keeps everybody focused. Because at the same time, once the boss figures out that you're having an organizing campaign, that the union word, the U word, is going around the shop, they're going to get in contact with one of the million firms in the United States that specialize in union avoidance. They're going to get all their managers trained up to bust the union. And they have a whole program for that. We call them the company tricks. That's the other thing, is this committee needs to know, one of me or Gary's job would be to do is make sure everybody understands and inoculate against what all of these tricks would be. One of the major ones is, the union's just here to take your money, and having to talk to people about dues and, letting them know what that is and how dues work, that it's not just for UE, it's not just filling bureaucrats' pockets, that they get their own treasury, that they get to decide how the money is spent. Because in UE, we have an open books policy and everything gets voted on by the membership. Another one is they're going to try and scare workers that the unions force them on strike. And, only they can choose to go on strike if they so choose. They would have to have a strike vote. And even then, a strike is a last resort that any union takes in order to win something, or depends on what it's about, what you guys are organizing around. We can't make you do that. No one in UE who's on staff or elected can come into your local and tell you what you have to do. So, in fact, it would be the locals telling us they're going on strike. And we just have to figure out how to help them. So, those are just a couple of the tricks that they pull out. Another one is they try and third party the union. Oh, why do you have to bring a third party in? We used to have such a good relationship, I have an open door. We have an open door policy for a reason. You can come in, you can tell me what's going on, and I can help you. Come bring a third party in. You have to do everything through the union. But the union is the workers. And that's something that we have to make sure everybody understands and is on board with. So the boss's tricks don't work at the end of the day. So when that happens, usually we're at the point of we get to step 3 after we've rated everybody in the shop and we know we have the support. We're going to go out and ask people to join the union. So the committee will have union cards or a petition, and they would go out and they would sign up their coworkers. Now what these cards are used for is so that you can file for a NLRB, a National Labor Board election. The boss never sees this card, so if I were helping these workers, only I would see them, and the people who were collecting the cards would see them. And we send them off to the NLRB when we file for the election. I don't know where they go, probably in a giant vault somewhere, buried under a mountain, who knows. But it doesn't go back to the boss, and that's what's important. People are afraid that the boss is going to see these signs up. Now, a really strong union, people would wear buttons and showing their support. That's one of the ways it builds up the strength of the union, visibility. And you're actually more protected at that point because it's known by a lot more people than just yourself or individually that you're in support of the union. Everybody knows you're in support of the union, and it makes it harder for the boss to do legal things like retaliate against you for supporting the union, which is a fear a lot of people have. So that's another thing I would recommend is show support for the union. Get people on board for showing support for the union, because at the end of the day, that's how you're going to be protected and have the most protections through protected concerted activity, which is what it's called. Once you have a majority of your coworkers signed up on cards and you file for the election, you're going to have to wait several weeks, like I said earlier, 6, maybe 8 weeks for an election date, where you have to continue to be organizing, continuing to wear buttons, and maybe you need to do some shop floor actions, like you got a boss who keeps trying to do some illegal activity by asking the workers if they support the union, which they can't. They can't ask that, or they can't ask about your opinion of the union. You can go and have a bunch of workers go and tell the boss that he needs to stop. Doing stuff like that continues to build the organization. and knowing that they can win means a lot. And then when the election comes around, you just want to make sure you get all of your yes votes out. Usually it's going to be a day or a couple of days of voting at a set time and place, or it could be a mail-in election, which is what we had for that HealthCon campaign. But you want to make sure at the end of the day you get all of your votes in, and you should know, and the company's going to know as well, what your votes are, and that's through a rating system that I didn't really get into. And then after you win the election, you're going to go into negotiations, which is just a continuation of the campaign, taking that program and then realizing it by doing a survey of the membership, figuring out what your proposals are going to be, voting on proposals, and then voting for your negotiation committee and going to the table with management and negotiating a contract that secures the things that you organized for.
Awesome. So I have one very important question.
Yes.
Is your dog unionized?
Yeah, definitely.
But in all seriousness, that sounds absolutely great. But one thing I've observed is that a lot of times people in the workplace, they might understand the benefits of having a union. They might understand that a lot of the arguments against unions that they might hear from their boss might be BS. But one thing that I've heard from a lot of people is just that they're tired, or that, they're just so busy in the evenings. They go to work, they grind out, they do their daily grind, they do what they need to do, and then they go home and they have kids to take care of, they have other responsibilities. Forming a union is a lot of work, and a lot of people sort of question, is this really worth the effort? I'm working at this company. Is it really worth forming a union here if I might risk being fired?
What stops you from being fired right now?
That's a good argument.
Everybody isn't covered under a union, considered an at-will employee. You can go to work at any time and wear the wrong color shirt and they can fire you for it. One of the things that happened out at the Lanternman campaign was somebody told me that they got on the elevator with the head of HR, but they didn't smile, and then they got disciplined for it. And that's just really dehumanizing. So I understand it. There is fear, but there's nothing that doesn't keep the boss from doing whatever they want or firing you as it is. You can't count on your boss's good mood every day for your good fortune. You need better protection in a lot of cases. And it's not about telling people what they need, but asking them what they would like to see and how you can help them get there.
Absolutely. So is there any other advice that you'd have for people who are interested in starting a union, or who are maybe looking to change the culture at their union? Is there any sort of general advice that you think you could give?
As far as changing the culture of an already existing union, the best advice is to go to meetings. Participate any way you can. If you don't like the way it's run, get more people to participate. I mean, usually if a union is not serving the needs of the workers, it's because the workers aren't the ones running it. But you can have a crappy union. The workers themselves can change that. You do have to do the work. It's unfortunate, and you got to take time out of your day to do this work. That's what has to happen. I would love to say the best thing to do is to drop that union and join the UE, and we'll help you out like nobody's business. But there's plenty of good unions out there that get a bad rep, and a lot of times it just comes down to the local leadership. It comes down to people in the workplace not participating, so they don't really have any idea what's going on. So if you have a union and you're aware of it, try and participate as much as possible. Try and get any of your friends at work to participate as much as possible, because that's where the real power is. It's not in your union leadership, it's in the workers themselves. And if you feel like one of you guys can do a better job of running your local, get nominated for an election or nominate a friend of yours. You can do that. Even if your union's a little bit corrupt, you can still do that. But, if it's really bad, call us up. We'll see what we can do about it.
Right on. So if someone did want to call up and organize with UE, how would they do so?
Well, you can go right to our website, ueunion.org. I believe there's big red letters that say like organize, and you can just click right on there and put in your information, and we try and get back to you within 24 hours.
And I believe the email address for Organize a New Shop, if you want to get in touch with us, best way is organize@ueunion.org. Is that right, Lindsay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's really great hearing from people who have on-the-ground experience with this sort of thing. Absolutely great to have you all on.
Totally. Right on.
Thanks for having us. For sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. Solidarity forever.
Solidarity.
Right on.